Hi guys, it's Bob Bianchi, again having an opportunity to guest host here at the Law&Crime Network. I'm very excited. We have the preeminent host of Law&Crime, Aaron Keller, with us, and thanks for joining us, Aaron. Looking forward.
Oh yeah, sure. You know, I just get spatially disoriented on this side of the table, but I do get a 365-degree view. So.
Yeah, it's like, you know, when you're on one side as a prosecutor in my career and the other side as a defense. For many years as a defense lawyer, I was saying, Your Honor, for the prosecution, and I'm like, I mean the defense. Probably didn't make my client feel too comfortable, but it was a knee-jerk reaction.
Well, you know, you were forgiven. Right?
Yes, absolutely. If you win the case, they don't care.
They don't care.
So listen, I mean, we're watching this Brian Hyde trial, and I just want to real quick get into that. We're going to go back and do some, I think, pretty amazing analysis of what's going on behind the scenes in the Tex McIver case with the lawyers from what I believe, of having tried and having taught lawyers for many, many years, is the biggest factor or problem they have in trying a case. And it's called FEAR, fear. It sounds odd. It has nothing in a law book. It's not from law school, but it really does affect the manner in which trial lawyers try cases. But first, let's go to this. I found it very interesting in terms of construction of case, and we're asking the viewers who are giving commentary, and again, I always, when I'm a guest, try to get to your, respond to your questions when you're online. When you're hosting, as Aaron knows, it's a little more complex because we're doing a couple of different things at once. But we actually have somebody monitoring your questions that you're going to be asking on the blog, if you have it with regard to this case or with regard to Tex McIver, and we would love to answer them. We can't answer all of them, but we'll try to do the best we can to get the ones we think are relevant, at least at this point in time. So something that I found interesting, Aaron, was there's a witness in this case, I believe, testified today. This is the husband that was making the phone call. And while he was making the phone call, his wife was at the location and she was saying, Brian, what are you doing? Or something to that effect. Now, as trial lawyers, when we're putting cases together, folks, it's not just about the evidence you have, it's about the presentation of the evidence to the jury. And we subscribe to a theory called primacy and recency. It's really about human nature here.
The first thing said and the last thing said
are the things that people will remember the most. And I want to go back to the OJ case because it's reminding me a little bit about this case. And in the OJ case, they had copious amounts of DNA evidence, and we all know how that turned out in the end, because the defense was able to do a good job at attacking Mark Furman and other things in the case, the compromising, the potential cross-contamination of that DNA evidence.
Bias, planting, you name it.
Absolutely. And to me, the most compelling part of that OJ case, from the very beginning, which would have been the central theme of my case throughout the whole trial, would have been the car ride in the white Bronco with Al Cowlings, the ski mask, and the $10,000 in cash and the gun, and showed that video clip. It may have been my summation, which is very hard for me because, you know, I'm a loquacious man, to said, just play that and click it and say, ladies and gentlemen of the jury, if those are the actions of a person that just found out his kids were orphaned, then you find him not guilty. They're not. But they never introduced that common sense piece of evidence that I think would have really resonated.
I'm trying to remember, and maybe you remember this more than I do because I was in middle school when this happened. And I wasn't considering thinking about going to law school at that time. I thought that part of the jury selection process was to weed people out who had seen that, and that it was ruled somehow not admissible. Or am I completely misremembering?
Yeah, I don't believe that. First of all, I don't believe it's ruled inadmissible because, as we all know, flight is certainly something at the end of a case that a judge can reach out, consciousness of guilt. I believe, as I recall it, and it really doesn't make a difference how well we recall it because it happens all the time, that there was a conscious decision to rely solely on that DNA evidence as being the wow factor. I, as a trial lawyer, I'm not a smart person. I've listened to DNA evidence being presented as a prosecutor, as a defense lawyer. I still find it hard to even ask questions of DNA experts. I think it's very complex. They give huge numbers. But nevertheless, to me, I would have led this case with the husband. It's drama. It's calling the wife. It's listening to the actual name of the defendant.
You know,
not the full name.
She's trying to tip somebody off to the name of the attacker.
Right.
That's the way you got to put it.
Right. And on the primacy and recency thing, this would have been my star witness in the beginning of all this. And just so the folks know, when we typically do the scientific testimony or the medical examiner stuff, this is stuff that we kind of put in the middle of the case because, especially when you're dealing with the ME, when you're dealing with the medical examiner, It's very, very arduous stuff. It's very technical. And in the end, I believe the jury only wants to know, was it a homicide? Wasn't it a homicide? There's no question about that in this case. So hopefully they'll bury that testimony in the middle, not in the beginning of the case. So what are your thoughts about how witness selection is done in a trial?
Well, look, I mean, I agree with you. In a textbook world, you want to start off with someone who's got something dramatic, who's got something very relevant, who can point the finger at the defendant if you're a prosecutor. You want to get to the heart of the matter. Sometimes if family members don't have anything horribly relevant to say, sometimes you need the eyewitness. Sometimes you need somebody else in there, but somebody other than a police officer,
right.
Somebody other than a medical examiner, generally is how you want to start out. We don't know the behind the scenes in this case, though. Maybe the witness was unavailable. Maybe the witness could only testify today. Maybe the witness had today off from work and couldn't get out of work. So, there's all this other stuff that goes into it. And sometimes it means a less than adequate presentation, at least from a literary standpoint. Everybody likes to have that, theatrical punch at the beginning of the case. Sometimes real life gets in the way. Bottom line is, look, they can use it on closing. And
Sure.
an evidence introduction is about meeting the letter of the law, as you well know. Right. And you're a pro at this, but it is also about collecting gold nuggets along the way to line up the closing argument.
Yeah,
Ladies and gentlemen, you heard from that man that his wife uttered the name of the defendant. And if they start the closing argument that way, it might have just as much impact.
Yeah, I mean, I don't necessarily disagree with the fact that it's not the end of the day. That testimony is there, and you certainly can make a big deal about it in the closing and in the opening statements. But I still would rather not have a gold nugget in the beginning of the case. I'd rather have a boulder smashing the jury in the face with something that is really like, wow, because it's going to be hard for the defense to recover. But what did we see? They put on some witnesses where the defense was actually able to start talking about, and this is a big problem I confronted as the head prosecutor with homicide work that we did, an improper evaluation or investigation with regard to things like fibers on the body that weren't examined, DNA that wasn't examined, footprints that weren't examined. And we're going to actually throw to a clip real quick, and we're going to come back to that. And I want to know what your opinion is. Like, in my mind, you start with that big, powerful piece of evidence. Brian, what are you doing? But no, rather, the beginning of this case, they hear things the state, the prosecution really should have done, and makes them look a little sloppy. Let's go to the clip. So what kind of impact do you think, again, in the beginning of the case, they're listening to cross-examination about things that the state did not do. Do you think that has an impact on the jury right from the very beginning?
Well, look, I mean, it might, but as you know, the defense attorney's job is to try to raise reasonable doubt. And there are always things in every investigation, at least that I've looked at, that are imperfect in some way. Every investigation, okay. The question is whether or not they're relevant. Well, they're relevant, okay, but the question is how big of a deal are they? Mm-hmm. Okay, look, that testimony came out. And then right on the heels of it, the state calls the DNA analyst, okay, to turn around and say, okay, look, we had rape kits on the victims. The rape kits indicate the defendant's DNA in various positions and in various sexual places on the victim's body, okay? That's a big deal, okay? That's really important evidence, in my opinion, and I think probably in the jury's opinion too. Then they say, okay, let's look at all the stains on the defendant's shoes. Right shoe, left shoe. All three of the victim's blood, DNA, is all over the defendant's shoes in multiple locations. Big deal evidence. Failing to collect a fiber here, fiber there, I mean, is that really going to tip the case when you've got rape kits with the defendant's DNA, when you've got bloody shoes with the defendant's DNA, when you have other swabs collected from the scene with the victim's DNA? Okay, this is setting up a case that at least seems pretty clear-cut that this defendant's guilty.
I agree it's a clear-cut case, but let me use two cases that I had as a homicide prosecutor where I can see it could be a problem. I'm not saying it's going to happen. Let's see. The fact you have somebody's blood on you proves that you have somebody's blood on you. There have been many cases in which a third party has entered into the scene to clean up the scene, help a friend out, and after the fact has disposed of the body, which could potentially explain why the blood is there.
Okay, yeah, I mean that can't happen. Is that the fact that we have here? Did he tell police that? Is he going to testify to that?
Well, he doesn't have to testify to it, and what the defense, I think, is going to do, potentially, is to argue that this sloppy investigation jumped to a conclusion, and they needed to get right to the part where he is saying that that blood certainly shows that he committed a crime. That's why I would have led, going back to that particular thing, with Brian, what did you do? And again, that doesn't necessarily prove that Brian did anything other than Brian was at the scene of a crime where there was a bloody rampage that went on. I'm just throwing it out there as kind of things that I've seen happening inside of a courtroom where a skilled defense attorney can bring it out. And I add to that parenthetically, they're always used to, I'm going to give you a behind-the-scenes thing that goes on in homicide investigations, or probably most investigations. And you folks would be probably interested to see this. There's a law enforcement component to a homicide investigation. Those are the cops, badges, and the gun guys. And then there's the lawyer part of an investigation. Those are the lawyers that are ultimately going to be handed an investigative file, and they're going to have to put that ball over the goal line and prove it beyond a reasonable doubt. And there is always friction between those two groups of people as to what is enough or sufficient and what more can you do. My experience has been, boy, if I could just lift the whole house out of its foundation and transport it somewhere so that down the road something like this comes up, the footprints weren't looked at, the fibers weren't looked at, then we have an opportunity because we didn't destroy it. And the other thing is a critical case review of the evidence, because sometimes, Aaron, you get so much evidence that comes in, believe it or not, the evidence actually gets overlooked as to what should be submitted to the lab and can come back to bite you, for example, when on the victim's body there are fibers that were never tested. Do you agree with that kind of proposition?
I mean, look, it's always helpful for police organizations and prosecutors to talk about whether or not they've got enough to shove the case over the goalpost. And that's where the experience of the prosecutor comes in. They're on call, they get text messages, they get emails, they get this, that, and the other thing. I need you to look here, I need you to look there. I mean, that's open communication between the front end and then sort of the back end of building the case. Mm-hmm. But, excuse me, you know, is it possible to overlook something? You hope you don't if you're a police officer, but can the defense find a way to wiggle doubt into a case? Yes, of course.
Yeah, and absolutely. And listen,
and the prosecutors are going to fear that.
And you said this before, and it is in fact a truth. I mean, no matter how much you can keep a crime scene, no matter how much you think in the beginning of the case you really don't know that much about it, and you can try to forensically process as much as you can. The fact of the matter is there is no pristine investigation. That's why you often hear prosecutors saying it's not NCIC, it's not a crime show, it's going to be solved in 30 minutes, we're not perfect.
They're not going to break down on the stand and suddenly confess. It just doesn't happen that way.
Right, right. Actually, an interesting anecdote, sometimes you could actually have a case, and I'm very thorough in my review of evidence, and I had a stabbing of a priest who was murdered, and there was a passion provocation defense being in there. So the folks know what that means. A passion provocation defense is where you're saying, I did it, but I did it because I was under the stress of the excitement of a reasonable provocation. I didn't have time to cool off under the law, and we got into a fight, and I stabbed him. My God, I'm sorry, I didn't mean to do it. I was kind of out of my mind. But, you know, right in the middle of the trial, I've got to admit, even though I reviewed all of the evidence and I was prepared to go, when the defendant was on the witness stand and I was cross-examining him, there was a little fact in the file, Aaron, where the defendant said it was a brown-handled knife, but we recovered a black-handled knife. At first I thought, the guy makes a mistake between a brown-handled knife and a black-handled knife, until I was looking at the evidence sheet in our case one day and it just popped in. A knife rivet was found next to the priest's body. And finally, I said to myself, my God, he used two knives. And that really goes to the passion provocation. He broke the first knife in the first round of stabbings, which we knew there were two crime scenes in the same kitchen, then went back and stabbed them again. He must have went back to the drawer, got the knife. When I confronted him with the rivet on the witness stand, he literally shut down and admitted he used two knives. knives. It was a
Wow.
compelling
Wow.
moment in the courtroom, and the jury.
Too bad we didn't cover that case.
Yeah, the
we
jury
weren't around.
The jury literally gasped at that because not only is it horrible for his passive provocation defense, it showed his credibility was not to be believed amongst many other things. So it is even easy with a very particular, nuanced, and very skilled prosecutor to miss the overwhelming amount of things that when you first retrieve it meant nothing to you at the time, but later on do.
I mean, look, if I'm allowed to ask you a question,
Sure.
because normally I get to do that. Average case, I know there isn't really an average case, but in an average case, how big is the investigatory file? 500 pages, 1,000 pages, 100 pages?
Yeah, that's a great question. In homicide cases, I'd say I've never had a homicide case that wasn't 30 to 40 bankers' boxes worth of materials. Now, I've worked in 2 different counties as an assistant prosecutor in a more urban, a lot of gang activity, a lot of shootings for those reasons. And then when I was head prosecutor, was in a suburban county, and sometimes based upon, and that's a great question, the resources that the county has will dictate the level of investigation that can be done. In a suburban county where there was a lot of money, our problem was information management. We had so much data coming in because we had so many resources. Sometimes information could get lost. One left hand doesn't know what the right hand is doing in interviews and things of that nature, or
linking it all
collection.
together on the back end. You got to read, 10,000 pages of documents and try to remember little tiny details like that.
Right, it makes it hard. Well, that was on the investigator side. On the lawyer side, you could miss a knife rivet in all that, for example. And that's why we actually created a tips and leads computer system so that every investigator, detective, and prosecutor had an opportunity to see what the other one was doing. Because, you can imagine this, folks. You don't know who's the bad guy, bad girl in the case, and you go out there and Detective 1 is interviewing witness A and Detective 2 is interviewing witness B, and they have information that would be relevant to the interviews of both of those individuals, but they're not communicating with one another. And so much sloppiness and cases of murder don't go solved because of that very issue. So you have to be really, really careful with that to answer your question. So listen, folks, we're asking that you put some questions out there. We're going to go back to the Tex McIver case, and I just want to give you a little tee up for this. I think this is really interesting. What are the lawyers doing emotionally? We talked about fear before, Aaron. One of the things that I thought was my biggest obstacle in getting my assistant prosecutors to try cases was the fact that they were fearful that they were going to lose the case, or that there was going to be a problem, and it's very difficult to get up in front of 12 people and to argue a case. It's an intimidating environment, not easy to do. So I actually hung up on the walls of our office in a number of spots the Man in the Arena by Teddy Roosevelt. And if you folks have never looked at that, look it up online. It's too bad it's gender specific, but nevertheless, it talks about being in the fight, and the fight itself is good enough. If you lose, you lose. If you win, you win, in order to motivate them. But the reason I'm bringing this out is that there is a lot of pressure on the lawyers in this case, both the prosecution and the defense attorneys. And right now is the, pucker up time. Right now is where they're sitting there and they're saying, what is that jury deliberating? What are they thinking? When they get the questions that come out, they're all trying to do a David Copperfield mentalist analysis. I know we're going to be covering that trial coming up, so I nuance that in. And you're trying to read all these things, but it is a nerve-wracking, probably the most nerve-wracking period. Why? We don't have control over the case anymore.
Yeah, it's funny that you bring this up, because I asked this question in the middle of the Stephen Avery murder case. When the jury got the case, the defense attorneys come down, and the first question that I asked the minute the jury got the case in that press conference was, Dean, Jerry, this is out of your hands now. This has got to be the most nerve-wracking part of this case for you, because I could just sense it in their faces, and they both just kind of sighed, and the reaction that I remember, I don't think it's verbatim, but was, thank you for recognizing that. We hope that we did the best job that we possibly could do, but we always fear that we didn't. Was basically what they said. And of course that made it into the Making a Murderer film. That question is in there from what I recall, but that explains what's going on. And there's the fear, along with some sense that there's some unwanted downtime. You have to give the jury the time to do its job, but what do you do when you're just sitting there waiting?
Yeah, you sit there and you
reassuring your client if you're the defense, you're fretting if you're the prosecution. one of my professors told me there's always three arguments. There's the one you plan to make, the one you make, and then when the jury gets the case, there's the argument you wish you had made.
Right.
And it's always there. It's the same when you're in front of an appeals court. You plan on one, you make one, and then you I wish I had said it that way. If I used that word, it would have been that much more clear.
Yeah, I never drilled down that specifically. There were some things I wish I could have done better or not done better, but I never found that that one little thing that I didn't do correctly or as well as I wanted would make the difference. It was just really, it's like waiting for Santa Claus to come at Christmas. You're just like in anticipation of, let's get this over. What's the finality? Of course, you want to win. Now, listen, one of our viewers, Aaron, getting back to the Tex McIver case, asked a question that actually, and I think it's a very insightful question. I'm not sure if I'm going to have an answer for you that's going to be satisfactory, but they're talking about the car and the fact that the jury was allowed to go back into the car with a gun, and one juror apparently, from what I understand, may have gone back a couple of times with the gun. In at least New Jersey, and I know this is different in many different states. Let me explain what the issue is. The fear of allowing them to do a demonstration, essentially, is that, for example, the juror went back 2 times, now has information, knowledge, or a perception of things that may be different from the other jurors evaluating the case. Whereas in a courtroom, if you ask for read back a testimony, it's clear what the read back is, everybody hears it, everybody sees it. In this particular instance, I've got a problem, maybe I'm old school with this, allowing people to go in there when the circumstances aren't exactly replicated. Seeing it, I get. Having the gun because pulling the trigger, I get. But allowing them to go in there and reenact the scenario, I don't get. What do you think?
You know, I've got a couple of issues with what went on, and you know, this is my old school legal perspective of it. I look at it and say, okay, well, I got an issue with it. If I were adverse to it, what would I do with that issue? I framed it up this way earlier. First of all, if jurors are feeling that they need to get in this car again, and one juror got into the car, juror 61 got into the car 3 times today, okay, to apparently do something, then there's 2 things going on. First, I've got an issue with burden of proof. The jurors feel like they don't have enough information to make a proper decision. If that is the case, you want to know what? No, they don't get to keep going in there because the state didn't live up to the burden to convince them beyond a reasonable doubt. This is the state's burden. They're not supposed to be doing experiments on their own to try to make sense of what happened in that thing. That is the state's job. That's my first issue with it. The second issue I've got with it is a confrontation clause issue. This is a constitutional right. The defendant has the right to confront the witnesses against him. Now you've got a situation where jurors are going in there and saying, well, I saw it this way, and they're telling other jurors what they thought when they were in there, and that's probably what's going on in the jury room right now. Well, when I was in there, I saw it this way, and when I was in there. Okay, well, who gets to confront that? Now the jurors are becoming witnesses to one another.
Right.
I see that the defendant has a constitutional right to confront the witnesses against him. I would have an objection about it on those grounds. After that, it just kind of irritates me that it's gone this way, but I'm trying to figure out legally how I would attack it. Those are the first 2 things that came to mind.
That's a perfect response, and the last point that you made is the one, like what I'm saying. If there is, for any other piece of evidence that was introduced at trial, it's the state's burden to produce the evidence. The jury can go to the court transcript, and all of them at one time can collectively hear the evidence that was actually produced by the state in the case. I agree with you completely. Here now we have random observations going on. I think it's very problematic. Listen, we're going to throw back to the Hyde court. We appreciate the question. Please have them keep coming in, and we're going to kind of bounce back and forth between the Hyde case and Tex McIver, and we really appreciate that. Here we go. Hey, we're back at the Law&Crime Network, and obviously there's a break, and we're going to be able to talk a little more Tex McIver. What could be any more interesting, Aaron, than a lawyer that's being charged with murdering his wife and all the salaciousness surrounding that. One of the questions from the viewers, though, is about this billboard thing, where the friends of Diane want to put up a billboard, and the question becomes, if there's a potential, if the jurors could be biased by us, or if they see this, whether or not it could be declared a mistrial. Is a great question. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, look, I mean, it could, and it raises an issue because how does the judge deal with it? The judge, under First Amendment law, shouldn't be in the position and shouldn't be able to, shouldn't have the authority to call the billboard company up and say, you can't show that. Okay, that's censorship or prior restraint. the government really can't do that other than in extremely limited situations. I'd really have to go back and triple check my case law on it, but I don't think that applies here. So what's the remedy? Well, if the billboard company, in theory, wants to, they could be putting all kinds of things up on these billboards. They could be saying guilty or innocent if they want, the same as we can sit here and utter it.
Right.
Okay, look, they can say it. The question is, what duty does the judge have to prevent jurors from being exposed to it? I guess the only remedy that just jumps out at the top of my mind is that the judge could sequester the jury at this point.
Yeah, listen, let's just so the viewers know, when in the beginning of a case, when a judge is given the instructions, and for those of you who may not have seen the instructions and don't know them, one of the preeminent things a judge is telling the jury, not only in the beginning of the case, but throughout the case, is that there will be significant media attention about this case. You are instructed not to look at the newspapers, go online, look at it, and have any contact with the outside world with respect to this case. And if you do, then you need to report that to us.
And indeed, this happened in the beginning of the case because the jurors were apparently being rounded up in a jury bus of some sort. I'm not sure quite how that process worked, if it was like a remote parking situation, or if they were being bussed in from a home. Whatever the process was, I asked about it, but the court never really got back to me. There was a news story about the trial playing on the radio in the jury bus.
Yeah.
And of course, so then members of the jury tell the judge, and apparently the judge just said, okay, look, I don't think this is going to, hurt anything. But, look, okay, so when you're talking to members of the jury and the judge tells them, and jurors take this seriously, they respect the judge, they look up to the judge in the courtroom, they want to make him happy, and they understand he's the guy with the authority. Okay, so he says not to read the newspaper, they don't read the newspaper. They tell their family members, do not show me the paper. Make sure I'm not around the paper, don't bring the paper in front of me. They don't look online. They don't go on Facebook. They're not watching the newscast. They don't look on Twitter. Okay, that's easy because they can make a choice not to receive the signals. They can go off the grid when it comes to the media universe on those things. Yeah. But if they're driving down the highway, they can't just shut their eyes to not see a billboard,
which is designed to have people look at.
Yes, exactly. I mean, that's not just sort of like a passive consumption thing. That is like you kind of can't avoid it.
Yeah.
I mean, especially if it's the face of the woman whose face you are also looking at in the pictures in the courtroom. It's the same picture. So I think it would be really hard for jurors to avoid it. That said, is the billboard really inflammatory? If they saw it, would they be influenced by it?
Right.
It's a thing that says in loving memory, and it's got the date of her birth and the date of her death and her picture and some clouds. It doesn't say justice for Diane. It doesn't say Tex is guilty. It doesn't say Tex is innocent. Okay. It doesn't say those kind of things. So, perhaps part of the analysis is going to be, even if they see it, would it really influence them?
Well, I mean, the thing is that time immemorial, it's been rock-bed solid law that the courtroom and the decision of the juror should be based upon, as you were just talking about earlier, the evidence produced in the case, and that they're not supposed to decide that case in the judge. These are, quote, sympathy, bias, or prejudice.
Or exterior pressure, and that bothers me about this billboard, because they could look at that and say, this community might be mad at me if I acquit.
Right.
But then I always go back, and this is why when I was a local reporter, I was always very cautious about talking too much about the jury's decision other than explaining it, because, look, you got to have information to inform people about what's going into the decision, but the jurors are the ones that sit there and listen to the whole trial. And when you get communities in uproar about decisions, nobody in that community sat and listened to that case as thoroughly as those people sitting in that box. Well, they might have heard something that everybody else, didn't hear, and that's important to respect the decision of the jurors.
Agreed, and I'm going to even take a sidebar. Something that I've noticed that I've always been fascinated with as a trial lawyer is that sometimes you have 14 or 16 jurors, depending on how long the case is, but only 12 deliberate, and the alternate jurors go into another room while the 12 jurors are in there debating. Now, every now and again, a juror gets sick or God forbid, one of my cases, a juror died, and the alternate juror has to go in and replace that person. They have to start deliberations anew when that new juror comes in. But I can't count, Aaron, how many times that I got a guilty verdict in a case, and then when we went outside the courtroom, the alternate jurors were like, oh my God, I'm shocked. The alternate jurors had a completely different view of the case, and that speaks to this collective mentality of 12 people that are debating and talking, and I think that's always amazing. But as to the billboard, I did have a couple of cases in which at the end of it, one was a 16-month-long trial where a juror had read a newspaper article. Not only did they read it, they went into the jury room and indicated, the judge didn't let certain evidence out about other things that this guy has done. I read it in a newspaper article. Now, that's a really bad scenario because that evidence was excluded purposefully under the law and rightfully so. The paper's allowed to report on it, but it was never introduced during the course of the trial. I thought we were goner. But what typically happens is that the judge has to bring each individual juror in to chambers and has to ask, what did you hear? And would this affect your ability to fairly and impartially come to a verdict and exclude that evidence? And if the judge is satisfied that each of those jurors can do that, the case goes on, as it did in that case, which resulted in a conviction and actually survived reversal. But here's my PSA for Diane's friends. Don't do it, because if you do it, you're giving the defense an appellate issue here.
Yes.
Or a mistrial potentially.
Look, and our producer Kathy Russin is pointing out, look, we don't know exactly when they plan to do this billboard, but it sounded like from the tweet that it could be over the next couple of days. Well, that doesn't say after the verdict, although it could be. Mm-hmm. Doing it after the verdict, that's one thing. Doing it when there's a chance at a verdict, I would agree. Issue for appeal.
Right.
Don't even make it an issue. Just don't do it.
Yeah. So, all right. Well, listen, I think we're still on break in the other case, and I wanted to actually show you a clip. Aaron was very kind and gracious to give me his cheater glasses here because I didn't have mine with me, so I'll put them on. I want to get your opinion about the end of the prosecution's I'll strike that. Actually, if we can go to a clip where the state expert pulling the trigger, if you guys have that queued up, while they're on the stand. So this is the state's expert, and he's on the witness stand. Aaron, I'm not sure if you saw this. He's in front of the jury. This is a case in which the prosecution is saying it is foolhardy, it is ridiculous, it is crazy, it's a lie that somebody could actually misfire a weapon. And the state expert on the witness stand actually essentially pulls the trigger and engaging the mechanism of the hammer. Can we play that clip?
In that case, if the gun is in a single action, so with the hammer cocked, it's primed, it's ready to be fired. The only way that the gun will fire is if the trigger is pulled and then held to the rear long enough for the hammer to fall. So if you were to pull the trigger, but then release the trigger, and I'll put my finger here so that I could feel it if it went through, it doesn't touch, because you notice the trigger actually moves forward with the hammer if I don't physically depress it. So the safeties still apply.
Aaron, sometimes what we see on the video doesn't necessarily impact it's having in the courtroom. We asked one of our law enforcement analysts yesterday, was actually in the courtroom, when that went on, or when the defense was actually summing up and showing that clip to the jury in summation, how powerful was it that in a case where they're claiming you can't mishandle it, that the state's firearm expert actually mishandled the weapon?
Well, look, the defense handled that exactly the way the defense should have, and that is the defense played the clip. And I said on Twitter, this is where cameras in a courtroom can benefit a litigant. Okay, if there is a huge piece of evidence that goes by in a split second like that, and of course they try to downplay it, and there's not a lot of attention drawn to it in the moment, going back to it and playing that video a couple of times.
Right.
Hey, look, this guy got up here and told you this thing doesn't go off accidentally. Guess what? He set it off accidentally. Yeah. In case you missed it, here it is. Play it. Oops. Let's watch it in slow motion. Oops.
It's brutal.
Folks, the state told you one thing and proved the total opposite, and play it up.
Yeah, I think that would be, to me, a central theme of my summation. It is such a common sense thing. It reminds me of a civil case I was trying, Aaron, one time where a guy was asking my client on cross-examination, well, don't you look at your feet when you walk? It was about walking, past something. And it was funny. I never even thought about it at the time, and my client was kind of confused by the question. But, we really don't look at our feet. We just walk. And he said, well, I don't think so. And he goes, well, you should have been looking at your feet. Otherwise, you wouldn't have tripped over that thing. Aaron, you can't make it up. As the lawyer was going around counsel table, there was an open trial bag with nothing in it. He stepped in the bag and fell. And we popped. I'm not making up. We popped up. We said, hey, you should be watching your feet. But those are the little things that go on in front of a jury that can have a tremendously powerful impact. And I'm sure that you know that from having seen those things before.
Oh, yeah. I mean, look, truth is usually stranger than fiction in some fashion.
Yeah, and sometimes
we watch it go down.
An unforced error can be more powerful than anything you even thought to present. Now, listen, we're going to go back on the Bryan case right now. There's a courtroom testimony happening, or a hearing right now. What's going on, Aaron, is at the end of the state's case, the defense is allowed to make a motion in most states in order to have the judge throw the case out, to dismiss the case. And generally speaking, the standard is that there is absolutely no evidence that the state presented that a reasonable jury could come to a conclusion that this was a murder or that this person committed the murder. The standard to win that motion by the defense is exceedingly high because, here's our fancy legal term, all favorable inferences are given to the prosecution, that is circumstantial or otherwise, at this stage of the case. This is made before the defense has to put their case on. It's kind of like a Hail Mary pass. I've never seen it as a successful motion. There have been some cases, maybe some minor charges get thrown out, but that's what's happening right now. And the defense has to make that motion, right? Otherwise, they don't preserve their right on appeal.
Oh, yeah, they have to make the motion. Okay, look, to not make it is malpractice. But look, in the Tex McIver case, we saw a similar motion succeed as to a couple of the minor counts. And look, you got to do it. And sometimes you can be pretty persuasive and you can get them to say, look, hey, judge, this thing was nothing like what the prosecutor sold at the beginning. The witness didn't go as far as the prosecutor liked. The witness, for whatever reason, dialed it back. For whatever reason, it just isn't there. If it's not there, the charge goes out the window.
Right. So I don't know if we want to stay with this because this is pretty, a kind of testimony or statements that are going on that we're pretty confident in this particular case are not going to be successful. The defense has to do it.
And indeed, I just got the note that the motion was denied.
Oh, there you go. This case is going like lightning, don't you think? Okay.
It is, yeah. I mean, but look, the state's got some pretty strong evidence. When you got the victim's DNA all over the defendant's shoes, when you've got the defendant's DNA on multiple rape kits, on multiple positions, why is the defendant's DNA in rape kits on the bodies of people who are related to him?
Right, and why is
this guy's going down. Look, that's the bottom line. Is I don't see this thing being an acquittal. I see this being a conviction.
Yeah, it's going to be a fascinating case to see how the defense is going to try to position this. He may go on, and the only thing that I can think of, at the end of a case, a judge reads to the jury that you can convict based on the evidence, or you can find him not guilty for a lack of evidence or the failure of the state to actually do something that you believe it should have done. I think that may be his only desperate attempt, and I agree. It's one that I don't want to see as a prosecutor. I don't want to hear that my investigators didn't analyze hair samples. I don't want to hear that they didn't analyze all the footprints. I don't want to hear that. I don't want to hear it, but we heard it here, and we do hear it because everybody makes mistakes. So we are going to go to Hyde right now and see what's going on in the courtroom. Wow, Aaron Keller, this is a little bit of a weird thing. I'm not sure if I've ever seen this in my career where there was a defense attorney cross-examining an expert in the state's case. They make a very brief motion to dismiss the case at the end of the state's case, and rightly the judge denies it. And the first witness the defense calls is the very witness that they had an opportunity to cross-examine. But now in the defense case, and I find it odd for two reasons. I think that this would have been persuasive information to bring out in cross-examination. And as everybody knows, cross-examination is a much more powerful way to get data and information out because you don't have to ask direct examination-like questions, which are open-ended. What do you think is going on
Well,
there?
you know, the first thing that comes to my mind, and I'm speculating here, but states have different rules when it comes to impeachment, and sometimes in some states you have to limit cross-examination purely to impeachment of issues that were raised by the party that called the witness. So you can't, on cross-examination, ask the witness to introduce new evidence in some of those states. I know it's a little bit different than what you're used to and what I'm used to, but I've seen it. I know Ohio does things that way.
Yeah, I don't know. I don't know if I see that. There was a tactical reason they did it, for sure. I don't know if it's so much of a legal reason because she was testifying about what was recovered and what she examined during the course of her analysis.
And then the state introduced certain pieces of it, and in some states, the cross-examination is limited only to those pieces that were presented on direct by the party that calls the witness. So you get into you sit in the host chair for long enough, Bob Bianchi, and you start to see how all these different states have got these little tiny nuances in their law, and it changes the procedure drastically.
No,
that's my guess. That's my guess.
Yeah, I mean, I comment on TV all the time about cases in different states. I have never heard that, but I'll take your expert wisdom on that. I think it's a clunky.
We had some weird things like that in a couple of Ohio trials we covered, and I'm like, is the rule of evidence, is the rule of cross-examination, is the impeachment rule different in that state? I looked at it, sure enough, it was. That's just a guess.
Yeah. Well, okay. So what did we learn in this? There's a little something squirrely here, right? There's something found, that foreign DNA that's not making sense. And what do you think? Did you score any points with that?
Well, look, I mean, I need to go back and really pick over the wording of the way that the questions were asked, but I know that the first time around they were saying that here's that individual, samples were collected from this individual that were foreign to, in other words, if they collect a sample from me and it's not my DNA, it is foreign to me. I'm trying to figure out how far they went and actually trying to indicate there is an unknown person out there.
Seemed a little strategic to me. We'll see where it goes, but they're back in court, so let's go inside and see what they're doing. All right, we are at the Law and Crime Network. We're thinking about covering the Copperfield. I love to make predictions. Just before we had to cut to that, Aaron, I was about to say, typically when a character witness gets it on the stand, it is prognosticating the defendant is going to testify. They try to build up, although that was a pretty weak character witness.
Yeah.
That's the best they got. But it's kind of like to lay the ground field, soften a little bit while the guy takes the stand. And in fact, I was when we heard he was taking it, I'm like, Dag, I wish we got an opportunity to say it. But here we go. Prosecutor's dream. Man, when this was happening to me, you didn't know whether he was going to take the stand or not. Remember, the prosecutor doesn't have a version of events, doesn't know what he's going to say. This is where the real skill set of a prosecutor comes in, because they got to cross-examine pretty much on the blind, not knowing what's going to come out there. And this guy, my old mentor, used to tell me it is a truth. Nothing they like more than to convict from the mouth of the defendant himself.
Exactly, and that's where we could be going with this.
Right. So I think we're going to be going back to the courtroom and watch this riveting testimony.
Right hand so the clerk can put you under oath.
Well, as us Italians like to say, holy cannoli. With regard to what we just heard there, I got to be honest with you, I'm in a little bit of a fog. I'm a little mystified. I've done this a long time in my career. I heard a character witness that got up there for like 15 seconds to say really nothing that was important. The defendant's taking the stand. You knew the prosecutor, I always use the phrase, was like a lion in a cage ready to get out there. And while it may not have been the most skilled, it was a good cross-examination, don't get me wrong. Aaron Keller, host extraordinaire of the Law and Crime Network.
You don't need to throw adjectives on top of it. I mean, people might disagree with you.
But the truth must be told, and it is my truth, and that's the only thing that matters. But anyway, I'm only kidding. Aaron, listen, did I hear this right? You correct me if I'm wrong. Did I hear the defendant say, first of all, let's talk about the defense. They called their own client, and it jumped out at me, and I bet it would the jurors too, that they never asked, did you kill these people? What do you think about that?
Well, look, I mean, I look at it from the knowledge of the evidence rules, which, you know, look, if you know your client's going to lie, you have to withdraw. You can't be a party to a client lying to the court. I read that into it.
Right.
That's what I read into it. And different states handle that different ways. In some states, if your client lies, you just have to not play a role in questioning your client. Okay, but you can remain on as the client's attorney. Well, one of my law licenses is in New Hampshire. In that state, if your client lies on the stand, you have to immediately withdraw from the entire case. Everything. The client doesn't get you for any more cross-examinations. The client doesn't get you for closing arguments. Nothing. You are done.
Right.
And when you make that motion, the judge knows exactly what happened. The judge knows that she has to let you out, okay? And you have to tell your client, by the way, if you even think about lying on the stand, I have to withdraw. You get zero help. It is designed to pressure the client to tell the truth. Not asking the question, well, that's what I read into it. Not wanting to get an answer that the attorney knows to be untrue.
But to me, it was a thundering silence because you're right. You cannot, at a minimum, suborn perjury on the witness stand, and none of us would ever be involved in a scenario where we would ever do that. So, but nevertheless, as a lawyer, I would have to say to my client, I cannot put you on the stand and ask the most critical question that this jury wants to know. Did you do it? And I can't ask that question, and when I don't ask that question, it is going to send red flags, bells and whistles out to them that I didn't ask the question for a reason. So right there, I feel that the defense putting the defendant on the stand was hobbled from the beginning. I think it read loud and clear. But wait, hold on, folks. You heard it. We've got more. Cross-examination. And Aaron, did I hear this right? When he was being asked, essentially on 2 or 3 occasions, whether or not he killed these people, his essential answer wasn't no. He said, I don't remember.
He doesn't remember anything that day until he crashed into a picket fence at the park.
Okay.
You know.
Yeah. So, I mean, listen, but that is a poor answer in front of the jury because not only do you have his defense lawyer not asking in a direct, he's not answering with a definitive, no, I didn't do it. He's got all this blood, all this DNA. Let's go back to the court and see what I believe to be some of the most riveting testimony that I've seen in a courtroom. Let's play this over again and take a look at it. But we are back at the Law and Crime Network with the most, one of the most amazing defense cases that I've seen with the defendant who I think did a really good job at sewing himself into a definitive murder conviction in this case. Well, I'm going to tell you something that bothers me just as an aside before we get into the substance because we already discussed it. It's just insane what he is saying. If I got 2 points, Aaron. I don't know what your 2 points would be. My 2 points are if I were the defense attorney right now and that testimony were coming out, I would have to go into my happy place. I would have to be in the back of my mind talking about, I'm going to have some spaghetti and meatballs tonight. I'm going to see my puppy. Everything's going to be
If you're having
okay.
that, I want to be invited over.
I want to drop into a fetal position and suck my thumb. This is bad for the defense. I
mean, look at the body language. I mean, the tension. I agree.
Yeah, and so and the other piece to this is that now. I don't know what other witnesses they may or may not be intending to call.
So they got one more. Don't think it'll take 15 minutes.
It's not going to be anywhere near as dramatic as obviously this testimony is. He did nothing to refute any of the evidence, any of the hardball questions like where the stuff I don't remember. But you know what bothers me? I'm going to tell you one thing that really bothers me. It's a trial tactic thing. I think you guys hopefully will like this. I'm bothered that the judge did not allow that question to be answered. He fed you, they sheltered you, and you killed them. That is not an argumentative question. It is a couple of facts strung together. He was answering yes, yes, and this is what bothers me as a trial lawyer. Some judges allow you to have your cross-examination. It's the first time you're getting a crack as a prosecutor at this witness, and some judges keep you very, very restricted. He had a cadence going, this prosecutor. He was on a roll. He had this guy saying he didn't remember. I think it was a completely fair question, and he actually got saved, the defendant, by the judge not by interrupting that question, because I think he may have said, yeah, I really believe it could have gotten there. What do you think?
Okay, look, I mean, I agree that you never know what would have come out of his mouth. I might have led up to it with another thing about taking the oath. You got up there and said you were going to tell us the truth, right? And really kind of drilled at that, built up with it a little bit more. I don't think it was an argumentative question, but again, I wonder if it goes back to the cross expanding the scope of the direct.
Yeah, well, I actually looked that up,
but that wasn't the objection. I realized.
Yeah,
so,
it wasn't.
It was an objection about argumentative. I don't know.
I don't know. When I've tried cases in front of judges like that really bothers me. Most judges let you try your case. Most judges say this is a fair fight between people if it doesn't violate the evidence rules. I mean, argumentative is in fact something that you could say. I don't believe it was an argumentative question. It was perfectly on point. I would have loved to have heard the answer, but nevertheless, overall, overarching, he got hammered with that one.
Yeah.
A lot of people, Aaron, have been asking the question online. Why wasn't he charged with first degree? Why wasn't he charged with a more serious offense given the heinous nature of this crime?
Oh gosh, I mean, it could be a question, and I'd have to pick through Florida statutes again. Is it because they don't have motive? Is it because they can't narrow in on, probably because they can't narrow in on one specific element that requires.
Right.
That's my guess.
Right. Well, listen, this is, I hope you guys love this, because I'll tell you right now, I love just doing this and hosting here for Law and Crime or being a guest on Law and Crime, but very rarely do we have opportunities to see defendants on the witness stand. Like I said, it's the #1 way defendants get convicted. This guy didn't do the job, I believe, that would have exonerated him based on a copious amount of other evidence. I really appreciate your questions coming in here, and we're going to have to be signing off very shortly for this. So for the Law and Crime Network, remember we're covering this case. Tex McIver is obviously out. This jury is debating, in my opinion, only the witness tampering charges only. I do agree that that
we'll
this is
wait
going
and
to be
see.
something that's going to be really impressive to see. Both cases. Aaron, thank you for being here, and thank you all for watching the Law and Crime Network. See you soon.